Good afternoon, everyone. I think a lot of our audience has been stuck in traffic. But anyway, those who are at the back, can you come forward so we can see you? Because the lights are blinding us. So there's a lot of space in front. I think we'll have a better conversation if we're closer to each other. Our topic today is a very important topic, at least for those of us who flew into Singapore to be here. We had to go through a lot of infrastructure to be here. And the topic is accelerating infrastructure investments, particularly in the region. During the past sessions, there's been a lot of discussion about Asia going to be the center of economic activity for the next 20 to 30 years. In fact, in Mike Milken's session, he mentioned that 2/3 of the world's middle class by 2030 will be in Asia. That's 3.2 billion people. What does that mean? That means we need to build infrastructure to make sure that we get goods to them, we get electricity to them, especially as Asia urbanizes. You need more and better infrastructure across the region. The ADB estimated that in the Asia-Pacific region, you need 8 trillion from 2010 to 2020. And so far, I think the estimate is that we will only be able to accomplish at most half of that. HSBC estimates an even bigger number of 11.5 trillion up to 2030. And this does not include the amount of money that we need to put into infrastructure for climate mitigation and adaptation. As we all know, and the region is going through another second strong typhoon right now, absorbs the more than 50%. And we have an insurance expert here. He knows that the Asia-Pacific region, and we in particular in the Philippines, is affected by a lot of natural disasters. And therefore, with a growing economy, with a growing population, and with the threats of national disaster, we really need to accelerate investment in infrastructure. Now the question is, how come we're not building infrastructure as quickly as we need? Of course, we need to remove Singapore out of the equation. Singapore is a special case. China has been investing massively in infrastructure, but the rest of the region are not as invested in infrastructure. In fact, there's been studies that the stock of infrastructure should be about 70% of GDP, and in the region we're below 50% of GDP. Is it a question of money? Mike Milken, in his presentation earlier in our conference, says that in Japan alone, both corporates and individuals, there's $23 trillion earning zero interest. So there is liquidity. There's liquidity across the region. In ASEAN, there's the central banks of the region hold over $700 billion in reserves. So the question is, there's demand, there's liquidity. How come we're not investing enough in infrastructure? How come we're not able to come up faster with this? And this afternoon, we're lucky to have panelists from different sectors. Let me start with the rightmost, Professor Lemma, who not only is a professor with the Jawaharlal Nehru University, but is also an advisor to the Indian government. So we will not only get his perspective from the academe, but also from the government standpoint. And on my immediate right is Don Canak from East Spring Investments, which is the asset management company of Prudential. So we will see it not only from the insurance standpoint, but from the capital market and investor standpoint. And on the left, farthest left is Jordan Schwartz from the World Bank. So we would like to get his point of view from the Multilateral Development Bank's perspective on how we can unlock this infrastructure bottleneck. And finally, to my immediate left is Xian Chao from ACOM. They help countries in implementing infrastructure. So let me start with Professor Lema on how he sees it from the perspective of government. How come we're not able to develop infrastructure as quickly as we need to? Is it a question of fiscal space? Is it a question of institutional capacity? So what are the challenges, Professor?
Well, I think the past in whole of South Asia, not only in India, had been a past which really witnessed a deep sense of infrastructure deficit. But two very significant changes are taking place in that part of the world, that is South Asia. And that is likely to trigger in the next 30 years, that's going to make the entire South Asia as the real theater of infrastructure building. The first significant change is, for the first time, you have large number of cross-border economic corridors or projects, primarily roads, communications, transports, right? You have India's Act East policy leading to connecting India's northeast part of India with Southeast Asian countries. You have Chinese projects, the China-Pakistan economic corridor going on. You have the Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar projects, which is likely to take place. So you have a plethora of cross-border projects. So what we are thinking is a region which remained most disintegrated for the last 70 years is trying to reintegrate, and the critical means of reintegration would be what you call the infrastructural projects. The second significant change in South Asia is each country is now quite clear about the alternative development model. For example, in India, there's a tremendous public pressure on the government to act, to deliver, particularly on infrastructural services. And in this case, it has now galvanized into what you call a national consensus where a development model would be purely based on what you call the involvement of private sector in a big way. And I think this is going to change. Now, you have, once you have a national consensus and you have a national priority allocated to what you call infrastructural services sector, then the government is trying to change the entire institutional structure, the orientations of the delivery services, the entire legal framework. So I'm sure in the course of next 30 years, right, or in the course of next 20 years, this will be the region where all the actions related to infrastructural developments would be focused into.
Professor, India's benefited from the fact that the leader of India now not only has a very good support from Parliament, but also has a vision of what he wants to do with India. And you mentioned the Act East policy of Prime Minister Modi. Do you think India has the fiscal space to implement the infrastructure that would be required for that Act East policy? And will PPP play a role in that program?
Well, I think it's going to be a kind of a very good blending of all kinds of combinations there. So, for example, India is now an eminent partner in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, right? Now, India is trying to mobilize resources from good institutions outside the country, within the country, right? And I think what is very critical today is For the first time, I see in India's budget this year, government declares infrastructure is the fifth significant pillars of development and allocates a significant amount of funds, right? And says that now this is the beginning, and it will lead to a series of huge, better projects, larger projects that would galvanize not only the nation, but also the states within the nation and the local communities in the nation. So it's a kind of a massive transformation. They're not talking about change. This is for the first time that we can see that there is some kind of a shift on a much, much larger scale that to bring transformation.
That's good to hear, because there's been studies that a country must devote over the next 20 to 30 years at least 6% of GDP in infrastructure in its budget. In terms of the pipeline, you mentioned the budget. Does India have a pipeline of projects that it wants to implement, and has this been communicated well to potential investors?
I think yes, we have for the first time the PPP policy in the country, right? A very comprehensive policy. And for the first time we have PPP appraisal committee, right? For the first time, Government of India has appointed a high-level committee by the name Kelkar Committee and submitted entire forward-looking policy about what is to be done. So in that report, and it's Government of India has accepted, Government of India says that it's going to operationalize this from this budget, right, onwards. It is in the pipeline. It is very specifically mentioned in great details about what is what in India's infrastructure sector and who are the likely partners, how they are going to involve them, and what are the offers Government of India is likely to give, what kind of institutional mechanisms they are going to get. I think the ball is rolling now.
That's good to hear. Don, you heard a professor mention that in India now, I guess they have their acts together in terms of what they want to do with infrastructure, led by the vision of Professor Modi to act east. And Professor mentioned also that part of that is not just from the budget, but it will also come from a PPP structure. And he mentioned that they put in place the ecosystem for PPP. What would be your the important considerations coming from your sector in terms of making, deploying capital, say to India or to PPPs in the region, and what has prevented you in the past from doing so?
Okay, thank you. Well, let me first of all, let me just say I think it's improving. Mm-hmm. It's getting better. The many things the professor touched on that are happening in India, I think from your experience in the Philippines there and in Indonesia and other countries in the region, we see that focus coming, that it starts with political will and leadership and that consensus you talked about. Mm-hmm. And then as time goes on, creating it, you used the good word, I think ecosystem. I think we should keep that word in mind. Creating a stronger ecosystem that allows investors, whether those are domestic investors or overseas investors, to see more clearly the opportunity, and then to build an investment thesis and a level of certainty that allows you to put money to work. Let me take a minute and just talk about how you said we didn't do much in the past and how we've got to the point where we are now, where we are investing in infrastructure in Asia. Prudential as a group, if we think of the UK as the original Prudential, has been a long-time investor in infrastructure. It's one of the largest investors in real estate and infrastructure in the UK. I think it goes back to the 1930s. Hydropower in Scotland was the start. But historically, Eastspring, which is the investment arm here in Asia, which today we manage about $140 billion US across the region, we had not invested in infrastructure. We had a broad range of equities, fixed income, multi-asset, some other alternatives, but we didn't really invest in infrastructure. A few years ago, though, since we're so across the region and deeply embedded in the region on the insurance side, I mean, we're one of the largest insurance companies in a number of the markets in this region, we realized that this demand was going to be big and get bigger, and that the asset class of infrastructure actually has a very good fit when you look at its characteristics for institutions like insurance companies. I mean, we are long-term providers of savings, pension, protection products. When someone buys a product, we probably are going to make a payment 10, 20, even 30 years from now. So we need long-term assets. And the characteristic of infrastructure assets being long duration, typically they're stable cash flows, especially if you're talking about infrastructure debt, tend to be non-correlated with other asset classes. I mean, there are some classes like toll roads that might be economically correlated, but relatively less correlated. And if you look at the available data, for example, Moody's data over a couple of decades of actual credit history, the infrastructure as a class has lower default rates and better recovery rates in default than BBB corporate bonds. So infrastructure loans I'm talking about. So from an insurance perspective, you would think this is a very logical asset class. And so we made a plan and hired an expert team with an infrastructure experience in the region, came on board a couple of years back now, and we've started making investments. Now, so from a perspective of a business, we see this as an opportunity, not only for the deployment of Prudential's money, but ultimately as a third-party service we can provide to other institutional investors since we have this local presence across the region. But that's different from talking about the scale that you want to see as a public official, or the scale that's needed overall in the economies to meet the needs of another, let's take ASEAN, for example, 90 million new urban residents. I mean, you touched on the need for urban infrastructure and the need for thinking about climate change, but just the basic infrastructure required for 90 million new urban residents between now and 2030. That's talking about scaling up to another level. So maybe just take a second, because I know we're going to go down the panel, but from the private sector perspective, there are a number of things which make it hard or more difficult to work in this asset class today than, say, other asset classes, right? I mean, and they're not going to be a surprise to anyone, but I mean, first of all, just the scale. I mean, if we had to fund corporations the way we fund infrastructure, right, where you have to eat the whole elephant at one time in infrastructure, whereas in corporations we've found ways to carve them up into things called stocks or bonds, and we take for granted the capital markets exist. Well, we're far away from that in infrastructure. So just the sheer size and illiquidity is an issue. So eventually, I think if you're talking about scaling this up from billions to trillions, we do have to come back to the question of capital markets and providing a way for infrastructure to be funded into secondary market sense and securitized or carved up in different ways that allow people to invest in, create markets, create hedging, things that you take for granted in the other capital markets. But that's not for now. Just for now, a colleague of mine has an acronym, STRIP. So the first step is standardization, right? When you just take India, any of the markets in the region, standardized debt instruments, standardized structures, standardized proposal formats for making bids and so forth. There's a lot of diversity. Everything seems to be tailor-made. That increased due diligence difficulty and makes every transaction more expensive and more challenging. The second, ST, transparency. Even though the PPP architecture is in place, it's still a little cumbersome in a lot of the markets. It's
Absolutely.
Not different levels of government, different ministries of government. Sometimes getting a permit is not clear, title to land. There's still issues that you can't. And even in a larger sense, in a pipeline, if you're an institutional investor and you want to have money invested and you have an asset allocation, you want to be able to say what's coming and when is it coming, and to be able to plan to have cash available to deploy when you need it. Challenging right now in the sense of the transparency of the pipeline. The third, STR and STRIP, risk matching. If you look at the big amount of, I think you mentioned 23 trillion. There are many trillions mentioned. We talk about the pension and insurance pools globally. That pool of assets has fiduciary responsibilities. It has standards for solvency and risk-based capital. Matching that set of standards and requirements to specific infrastructure projects in some countries where there isn't even a sovereign rating, some countries that have a sovereign rating that might even be lower than the project rating if the project is credit enhanced, it's complicated. So we need more vehicles and methods for risk matching between those pools of capital and the specific investment targets. STRI, investment markets. I'm going to skip over that because I mentioned capital markets earlier, but ultimately project bonds and other forms of instruments that would help make a more liquid market is important. And it will be important domestically. At the moment I'm talking about more cross-border investment, but generating that in the domestic market so domestic pools of savings can go into infrastructure will ultimately be the thing. And then finally, STRIP policy. By its nature, infrastructure is a public affiliated asset class. It's a community, it's providing essential services to a community or a region or the nation. It's going to depend on policy. So the stability of policy and regulatory regime. And then from an investor's perspective, I can tell you just very practically, in this region, the regulations for insurance assets are not harmonized. The rules, what loan can you make and under what circumstances, you find situations where it's either because of regulation or because of solvency rules, funding with a local balance sheet from an insurance company, a local infrastructure project can be a challenge. And so there's work to do on the policy side, just the plumbing, as I would call it, to get the asset regulations and the solvency rules more in harmony with the public policy goals of governments to build infrastructure. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Don. You gave a very interesting acronym, STRIP. We'll get back to STRIP later, but let me get to Xian Chow, who's from AECOM. AECOM is a $19 billion design engineering firm involved in implementation of infrastructure projects. So my question, Xian, is what do you see as the difficulty in bringing more infrastructure to a reality?
Yeah, well, actually, thank you for having me. First one, we're as I say, we're a very large global company, provide design engineering, construction services, investment and operation management service for our clients' infrastructure assets. We see the design engineer is no longer capable to deal with today's infrastructure challenges. We're talking about large, complex, integrated infrastructure projects. And then also, we really have to see infrastructure with a very different perspective. What is the vision and how do we deliver, no longer just one single approach, but look at holistically and then also engage with different stakeholders through different stages. Not to mention with innovation and then new technologies. So these becomes a very critical approach, not only through infrastructure to create value for the local community, but how can we go beyond just local community and then see the benefit through probably cities or countries or even mega regions to create not only value, but have a very good return of investment. So what are those criteria becomes very critical. So I see from our point of view, there are probably 5 very important criteria we need to look at it before we look into the project. First one is really the connectivity. I'll talk about that later. I think the second one is really the productivity. The third is the resilience of the project. Fourth is authenticity. And then last but not least is the partnership. So maybe I can have the first slides number 1. Talk about connectivities. Connectivity is no longer mobility, and then people talk about connectivity. It's really not just road, bridge, port, airport, or tunnel. I think it's really talk about the energy, talk about the power, talk about the digital and the cyber connectivity, and then also the ecosystem, the green belt, the blue belt, and how the ecology is connected as well. And then last but not least is the social and economical. There's intra-city challenges, there's a cross-border challenges. India, the Delhi-Mumbai corridor, it's close to 200 kilometers across 6 states, and 24 cities. The land itself close to 14% of the entire India's land, and the population is 17% of the cities. 70% of the entire Indian population. So the size of these kind of work, the connectivity is really fundamental. And again, not just roads, bridge, but you have to think very holistically. I think the second is I talk about productivity. Maybe I can have the second slides. The productivity is really, you have to think infrastructure in a very different format, and then how infrastructure can enhance the productivity of the region, and then also make this place much more competitive, and that's very critical. When you do an airport, you no longer think about airport itself, it's really, we talk about Aerotropolis. When you do an industrial hub, it's no longer just industrial park, how the Singapore, China, they built this very famous industrial park in Suzhou, really set a new lifestyle for very sizable population, and decentralize Shanghai, and then also boost the economy for Suzhou as a city. Next one is smart cities. It's really how to really set or understand what's the future infrastructure, and then make it much more sustainable, for the living environment. So these are what I say the productivity really enhance the region's economic value. The third one, maybe I have the third slide, that's the resilience. We talk about climate change, we talk about the natural disasters, we talk about the sea level rising, and then we talk about the terrorism. It's really about how to prevent through a proper infrastructure. And of course, we need to have a recover, like earthquake, or in Japan, nuclear decommissioning, the Christchurch rebuild the city. And we talk about how to supply the better resource, like in Singapore, the deep tunnel sewage system. And then last but not least is a lot of major event, like London Olympics. It's not only you said that for 19 days Olympic game, is really how to, through that game, you revitalize the natural environment, build economical, sustainable new cities for the future. So these are the things I think that's very, very important. Next one is probably very hard, slide 4, is to measure, but I think it's very, very important to really understand the challenges of infrastructure. Is it authentic? Good for the people, not only for the economic reasons, but bring back the natural, the social, the cultural value. When I say bring back the culture or social, it's not preserve the past. It's really understand the future kind of a lifestyle to set a new stage for the future. It's very critical, to understand that that really bring the value to the infrastructure, and then cost, and create the best return of the investment. Like Tokyo Midtown, it's really changed how people see simple, like a public room can affect the city center, to add the value for the entire city center. These kind of sometimes it's a very simple approach, but completely change the lifestyle. And I call that the human value, the authenticity. So, and then last but not least is the partnership. As I mentioned, you really have to see the infrastructure development in the very different integrated, holistic way. It's not only just from the inception to design, to finance, to get it built, but also operation and management. And through different phases, you really have to build a very strong partnership with the government, with the investor, with the professionals, and then in a different stage, and then make sure that the deliver at the end is very good for the sustainable future. So that's what I think. There's a lot of things that needs to have a different perspective, have a different vision, and then that's our current challenges are.
Xian, that's a very ideal conceptual framework for building infrastructure. I can imagine Singapore to be doing that, or even China. But in your work across the region, do you see the countries of the region having the institutional capacity to be able to prepare infrastructure projects on this basis? Considering the fact that although bureaucracies tend to be there, political leadership don't tend to come in and out over a shorter period of time.
No, but some of the critical infrastructure project, you probably need to set up a separate institution. For example, now we're working with the Clark, base conversion and make they call Clark Green Cities, and then you have BCDA, as a agency deal with the redevelopment of all these military base, or like the Delhi-Mumbai corridor, they have separate agencies, to deal with that. For some of these very large mega structure kind of infrastructure, you need some kind of different governance and different organization to look after it, to set the vision.
Yeah, I would like to add.
Professor?
This is why the highway story in India is relatively a successful story is precisely because of this. The government of India created National Highway Authority of India and gave it special powers related to legal issues, related to administrative issues, finance issues, to a large extent even on regulatory issues, right? So it actually became a model. I fully agree with you that in some cases you have to really create an exclusive institutional framework.
And then also, have a different approach. For example, we'll talk later, we're probably going to discuss about investment. We know a lot of infrastructure is very long-term return, but how can we speed up that return, have a different approach like the MTR in Hong Kong, kind of combined with the real estate development, with the adjacent land. It's really becomes each subway station becomes integrated urban development strategies. Now China is doing, we call transit-oriented development. So these kind of things is also very important. You have a separate agencies, and then quite independent to a certain degree, but have a very different approach, a holistic approach, from investment to implementation, and then you see that together. So I think that's very, very critical.
Thank you, Xian. Jordan is with the Center for Excellence of the World Bank in Infrastructure. He based here in Singapore. As we know, the infrastructure has a long life cycle. And during each stage of that life cycle, you face different types of risk. So my question, Jordan, is how can the World Bank and other MDBs help mitigate different types of risks during this, the different stages of the infrastructure life cycle? And what best practices have you seen done across the region that we can share with the audience, or even challenges that you've seen? The World Bank has been active not just as a center of excellence, but for example, assisting the Philippines from 25 years ago. Jordan?
Well, it's a big question. I guess the life cycle brings different risks because of sort of the processes that were just laid out. They range in everything from land acquisition and policies for resettlement, economic regulation, since we're talking about basically monopoly services and public services, even if they're privately provided, need some sort of economic regulation to make sure that prices are affordable. In some of the sectors we have markets, energy sector in particular, and in many cases what we find one of the biggest risks is that the infrastructure itself is not what is producing the revenue that will finance the infrastructure, and particularly in the transport sectors. So the bank and I don't know if it's risky to speak on behalf of the regional development banks as well, but I think all of the MDBs face this sort of challenge when they are advising governments or working with governments or financing the investments themselves, which is the challenge of sequencing. There's impatience, there's huge pent-up demand, there's needs, there's unmet service requirements. We were talking about this a bit on Wednesday. Just to pick on Indonesia for a moment, if about 30% of the urban population has access to household connection for water, you don't necessarily want to engage, or every mayor doesn't want to engage a multilateral development bank in a long discussion about land rights or about protecting water resources, or about 5-6 years of planning and design work that's required in order to know how to extend services. They want that service now. So we have sequencing challenges as we're trying to figure out how to mitigate these risks. What I would wish I could do would just be to list all of the credit enhancements, all of the public forms of finance, all of the guarantees and insurance products that we offer, and say this is how we handle the risks, but it would be a facile response. The truth is that the real risks lie in the underlying economics of the projects and in the interface with the consumers. That's the truth of infrastructure service, and that's really how it's differentiated from other forms of investment. So I guess if I were to step back and try to answer this a little bit holistically, I'd say that it depends. It depends on the sector, it depends on where they are, and where it is in its development. If we are in the Philippines and we're asked for advice on how to introduce greater share of renewable energy into the energy sector, we have an existing market. We have relatively liquid forms of finance, at least at current levels of investment needs. We have power purchase agreements that we have seen that are functioning, basically. And so we can focus on issues of pricing that are specific to those technologies or other incentives that would change the matrix of power. But if we're working in an urban environment where there's a lack of basic service and we're being asked how do you mitigate risk associated with urban transport system expansion or water and sanitation expansion, we're really back to very old economy questions of governance, questions of fiscal management, of land rights, and we as an institution have to, in a sense, put those things and our ability to advise in those areas or provide technical assistance ahead of financing instruments. Financing instruments will come second, probably public forms of financial support for most of what is infrastructure. So I guess if I were to pick out where in the region where things have worked well, many things have worked well, right? First of all, it's easy, especially for those of us who eat and breathe this topic, to get a little bit jaded. But the truth is many things have worked well in this region, not just in Singapore, but we should mention that Singapore sort of sits as an example of how when you have a lot of that governance in place, you have public utilities that are financially whole, you have public agencies that keep an eye on the quality of service, and you have cost recovery tariffs, and a population that's willing and able to pay a tariff that provides. Then you have all kinds of financing options in front of you. You can go to the bond markets and raise capital as a government, and you know that the infrastructure will actually get built and be relatively high quality. And likewise, if you decide that you're going to do a water treatment plant or a desal plant, whatever, an incinerator in a PPP structure, it's just another procurement option. You can try that as well and see if you're able to introduce efficiency gains. So we've seen some of those variable tools being applied, of course, in Singapore. Quite a bit use of local capital markets in some of these PPP structures in Malaysia. We see a functioning energy market really in Thailand and the beginning of standardization of power purchase agreements in Thailand as well. And yourselves in the Philippines may be the greatest example of a middle-income country, lower middle-income country that had early on experimented with different approaches to bring the private sector in, to introduce market forces, market signals. And for all that we critique or receive critique about Manila Water or some of the other larger endeavors, the truth is there's been quite a lot of success as well in the use of the private sector in those mechanisms. So I think the region has a lot of good examples. Each one is very different from the other. But you know, if I'm being honest, I think about what we end up doing at the end of the day. Man, I'd love to tell you that it's about the next form of partial risk guarantee or just the first loss facility that we are inviting institutional investors in through the IFC syndications group to participate in. Those are cool and they're fun and they're important. But the big heavy stuff, the real changes to quality and level of service delivery is still about, it's about land and it's about prices and it's about regulation and it's about the governance of the utilities, really old economy questions that have not yet fully been resolved in all of our countries. That's where, you know, when we're at our best, we're working on all of those things. And when we're not on our best, we're just kind of picking apart different pieces and focusing on one or the other.
You mentioned the old economy. So with old economy, maybe old politics and old bureaucracy. From, again, your vantage point, how important a role in terms of stumping private investment does political risk or regulatory stability play a role? And how can a World Bank help mitigate these types of risk?
Well, thank you for teeing up that question. This is like my favorite question. 18 minutes and 37 seconds left. I could kill the whole thing with this.
Belinda will give us more time.
No, cut me off after about a minute. But a point, again, we had mentioned briefly on Wednesday, with infrastructure, unlike other forms of direct investment, infrastructure is highly sensitive to sovereign risks, to a variety of forms of sovereign risk, and to the political sub-elements of that. And there's a lot of econometric work that we've done on that question. So even the propensity to invest is very sensitive to those risks. And it's a pretty good predictor, not just correlated, but when we regress these factors, it's a pretty good predictor, the sovereign risks and political risks of what the volumes of investment will be as well in infrastructure, not in foreign direct investment generally. So that's the short answer to the first question. Infrastructure is really sensitive to all of those governance issues. And what we can do about it, we have a variety of political risk insurance products, breach of contract. First, we have guarantees against non-honoring of financial sovereign obligations. Through MIGA, through our Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, we have, those are roughly market priced within the halo effects of the World Bank, but they're market priced. In other words, those are products that get costed over to the consumer one way or another via the developer. We also have guarantees that we offer through basically the balance sheet of the World Bank, and it comes out of the borrowing capacity of the government. So we have partial risk and partial credit guarantees as well. And these are really useful instruments. We have a commitment now, the World Bank has a commitment, it's just announced, to double the use of guarantees over the next 3 years. I think we'll see rolling out of these kinds of facilities. We also had, as I mentioned, this emerging first loss facility that the IFC has been developing. Don could probably talk a bit about that. And those are really interesting and really important. But I want to pick up a point that was made earlier on that you had made, which is this is for those projects that are close to being commercially viable now. So the environment in which they're being brought to market is roughly sound, but they need a little bit of help. They need a little bit of help because of investor nervousness about what might happen to currency or what might happen to government, let's say, losing its faith in the project over time with change of governments, if it's a political risk insurance product. But there's a whole set of investment in infrastructure, the other order of magnitude of investment that's needed that probably isn't even that close to benefiting from a credit enhancement before somebody will step in. It's not even approaching that level yet. Particularly in this region, ironically, for all of the discussion about infrastructure and all of the high growth economies, for all of the urbanization rates and the growth of the middle class, this region in particular is still largely a state-owned enterprise-driven structure for most of the infrastructure, public works-oriented development of its infrastructure. And I think will take part of a generation to morph into something different. I think it's going to be incremental growth, and we need to do better, offer more of these credit enhancements. But I don't think we'll see a revolution coming from these products themselves. There needs to be attention to the fundamentals and the governance of the sector. The old, what is the term that you use? The old politics and the old concerns.
Economy.
Yeah.
Jordan mentioned a lot of insurance products there. My question to our insurance man here is, has those worked, and how can we improve those so that we can encourage more private sector money to jump into this space?
Yeah, well, I think that they are starting to work. I mean, we've seen the products that Jordan mentioned, some of which are existing, some of which are still on the drawing board, where you're dealing with providing enough credit enhancement, not a complete guarantee. The private sector isn't looking to have a AAA investment.
No.
Really, you just want to have, as you said, get it to a point where, as a fiduciary, the risk-return relationship makes sense. Those products, I think, have a big potential. Some of them are already working. Project bonds in Europe, the European Commission and the EIB have done a number of, in a pilot phase, have done 10 deals of project bonds that are now issued and actually are working. So you do, I think, see a huge potential for this. And what I think is happening, and it's, to me, exciting, is to see the mind change, the shift in the attitude around the multi-level development banks, multinational development banks, in terms of their role, not as just making loans, which in effect competes with the private sector, but the idea of credit enhancement to crowd in the private sector. So that in itself, did you say double or triple? What was the?
Yeah.
Well, double in 3 years.
Double in 3 years. I mean, it's still the total amount of guarantees being issued by the entire MDB complex is in the order of a couple of $2 billion a year. But as that number grows, and as people get experience with these enhancement features and then can turn them into bonds and make them more liquid, I think that's a big medium-term expansion of the amount of capital that can flow to the sector. I think in the long term, I mean, it depends on which big number you believe. If you believe the McKinsey big number of an $800 billion a year gap up until 2030, and you look at that's $12 trillion, and you put that into a scale, okay, of how big is $12 trillion? Well, it would be, I think it's 1.5 times all alternatives today in the global market. It's a big number. These kind of things won't get us to $12 trillion. They'll get us to a small number of trillions, hundreds of billions of dollars. And I think for the projects that are eligible and investable, I think it will make a big difference, and companies like ours and others that we can help will be able to participate. But the really big number, I think ultimately has to be funded by creating domestic pools of capital, right? Countries can't, I mean, the emerging market, the idea of borrowing that sort of money from foreign lenders or foreign investors is probably not sound anyway from a macro perspective. But the domestic pools of capital, if you look at the ratios, I mean, it's quite, you know, I mean, it sort of jumps out at you. The pension and insurance assets as a percent of GDP, in the U.S., pension is 83% of GDP, insurance is 45%. In Japan, insurance is 93% of GDP. If we get to the Philippines, insurance is 8% and pension is 4%. So in Indonesia, it's 4 and 2. In Vietnam, it's 4 and about 0. So those domestic industries, if you want to think of them that way, pension and insurance, have got to get much bigger. And that, mobilizing the domestic savings to invest in the domestic economy, is ultimately the best way to reduce risk, because then projects will be funded at duration matched and currency matched. The banking system won't be making long-term loans. It'll help improve the banking system's stability. And ultimately, if the government has been able to foster a strong pension and insurance system, that's removing contingent liabilities from the government that ultimately the growth in retired population. So by funding the growing, you're also funding the graying, right? And so that to me is the sort of win-win, and that is a generational thing. That's not going to happen in the next, by 2030, but hopefully by 2050, when you need that the multi-trillions, you'll have a domestic financial ecosystem, which is a great word, that can fund it.
Thank you, Don. Don mentioned earlier the acronym STRIP, and I said I was going to go back to that acronym. In particular, S, standardization. As you know, infrastructure projects are basically heterogeneous. They're different geography, different sectors, different sources of funding, et cetera, et cetera. So my question to both Professor Lemma and then Xian is, you think standardization will work, and where will be the opportunities for standardization?
I think, in a country like India, where you have diverse geography, diverse communities, and you have a national government, then you have a provincial government, then you have a local government. I think thing like, say, model concessionary agreement, right? Or things like, say, viability project funding. I think that has to be done at different context at different levels. You get my point. Otherwise, why projects have failed? Many projects have failed precisely because many of the local considerations or social considerations were not taken into consideration, right? The second important thing which I would like to highlight at this point is when an investor goes to India, a country like India, everybody looks at Bangalore or Delhi or Mumbai, right? I would always feel that the investors now, they have to relocate India and renegotiate with India, precisely because there's a tremendous opportunity in the northeast part of India where you have a separate ministry exclusively devoted to northeast part of India. 10% of the budgets of all the ministries go to northeast part of India, and that is supposed to be the most infrastructure deficit, and Government of India is now primarily targeting Northeast India for infrastructural projects. So when I talk to the investors across Asia, right, nobody talks about Northeast India, where that provides the largest opportunity. The last point I would like to mention here is when you really talk about opportunities, like we have now a very good PPP framework, but I am afraid that many of the provisions are not still attractive enough for the domestic actors also or the foreign actors also to come in. For example, I will see the Prevention of Corruption Act, right? If you see what has happened in the past, many of these stressed projects, you have seen that many of these projects have failed precisely because they have been, stressed projects have been what you call red flagged, and the successful projects have not been flagged at all. So every time you say red flag. And one of the reasons why red flag projects exist today also is because the Prevention of Corruption Act is not able to distinguish between a genuine error, right, and an error which is done with malified intention. So the bureaucrats are really scared of, they think 10 times before taking any decisions because they'll be booked, right? So they need to be protected. The other thing which I have seen increasingly in these stress projects is, that's why the question of standardizing comes, is the project document, right? The project document is not professionally up to the mark, right? Say, for example, the very famous Delhi Airport Railway project, this Reliance company and the DMRC failed precisely because the project document projected that there will be a footfall of 40 to 50,000 passengers every day, whereas the real footfall was 11,000, right? So it failed. It could never recover, right? So I think capacity building among various stakeholders across would be of critical importance, and I think I see a major role for an institution like World Bank.
Yeah.
Well, I agree. I think it really depends on the geopolitical situation and then the project phase. I think standardization is critical, but agility is probably even more critical, particularly in the developing countries. I mean, in the developed country, of course, it's easier to standardize. It's very sophisticated, from the public side and from the private side. But in the developing countries, agility is very, very important. And then, but depends on which stage of the project, and then you do have to have a certain standard in order to control and monitor the progress. That's my quick answer.
We have less than 5 minutes left, and I'd like to ask each members of our panel later on to just give us a quick wish list. What you think can help accelerate infrastructure. But I'd like to ask the floor if there is, we have time for one question from the floor. Yes, please.
It's actually mostly for you, Mr. Secretary.
Oh.
Sean mentioned Bonifacio Global City.
Yeah.
Clean, great traffic, nobody on the streets. And I don't know the background of that. Was that a partnership between Taguig City or the federal government and the private sector, or was that solely private sector? And then is it replicable? And maybe that's the more broadly applicable question.
Well, that was a former military base that was privatized, and then the bidders partnered with authority established by government to convert bases into assets of government that can fund some of the needs of the military. So it is a private-public partnership, and it is where we're trying to replicate it with the Clark Green City project, which is 20 times or 30 times in scale of this one.
Yeah.
So
I was working on that project since 1995. At that time, again, the land owned by the Philippine government, and then 45% is BCDA, Base Conversion Development Authority, and then 55% by a consortium of the banks and investors. So that's at the beginning of the projects, and then of course the vision is really set a new urban standard for the Metro Manila. So it's a very interesting case. And then I was just talking to one of the leaders this morning, and then that project is up to now still very, very profitable, and then and help the government to invest on other projects, development like Clark, Green City, because the government needs to have money, and then the money generated, the land price is more than 20% compared to at the beginning when they sold the land. So it's really important. Use that to leverage the financial investment to other projects.
we have exactly 2 minutes and 5 seconds, so I'm going to give each one 30 seconds for your wish list of what you think should be done.
I think the most critical factor for an investor in South Asia is, the governments have started making strategic departure from the past. Whatever has happened. There's a tremendous public press, and I cannot see that strategic departure emerging among the investors from outside the country. And I think it's high time that the strategic departure, which is required in order to really take advantage of such a huge investment opportunities in South Asia, that also emerges in the thinking of the investors outside. Thank you.
Done?
I think domestically, just keep the focus on making the pipeline more visible and transparent and moving projects along so that it's easier to see what the issues are and how to make them investable. That's the number one thing. And on the global side, I think these various experiments or developments that the multilaterals are doing with private sector, as soon as they're working, they need to be spread out and magnified and built to scale. I think if we do those two things, local and global,
thanks.
it'll work.
Xian?
I think it's about partnership. It's really the working together to set the vision, to have a very clear roadmap, but also needs to be spontaneous enough to deal with risks, because there's financial risk, geopolitical risk, and then you have to be very careful about the investment and development strategy, and then working together and have a very thorough communication and then a creative mindset in order to move forward.
Thanks, Jordan.
Oh, I would ask for a good Secretary of Finance in each of the countries that I'm working with who understands these issues. Hope springs eternal, but it's and maybe sentimental as well. I guess 5 years ago, asked that question as we were establishing the Global Infrastructure Facility. We focused on the institutional investors, the Prudentials and East Springs of the world, and the superannuation funds and pension funds. We said, why can't you all be more like Ontario Teachers or the couple of superannuation funds that are really out there, mobilize this great bucket of money that you're sitting on that has a lot of patience and matches neatly against the assets that we're going to bring to market. So there's a hope that now they're there in a way, or they're almost there, and Don is sort of one of a small handful of firms that are leading this. But the banks, the multilateral development banks and the governments are not yet, have not yet brought forward that pipeline. For us, it's more than a pipeline, though. I guess in the end, I don't really care if banks get rich, or if as a development agency, or even if insurance companies turn a profit for their. That's not what gets me up in the morning. What gets me up in the morning if people don't have water. And people don't. So I want viable projects, but it's because I want my utilities to be functioning and to be whole. And then I want them to have options on how they go and finance. And then I want those forms of capital to be patient and to be relatively low interest rate, basically, so that cost of capital passes on to consumers in a way that's not too aggressive. So my big wish list is a good Minister of Finance or Secretary of Finance who can bring together all of the players on the ground, work with those that have the interest and the skills to bring projects forward and to do it in such a way that meets the consumer's needs.
Well, your wish is granted. We have Sri Mulyani back in Indonesia.
There you go.
And of course, Starman here in Singapore. Ladies and gentlemen, we've run out of time. There's still lots of topics that need to be discussed in the space of infrastructure, capital markets, and how to deal with the other risks. But please help me thank our panelists for their time and ideas and wisdom. Thank you.